Okay, Warren's real mom exposed everything about the Nolan Wells case, and I need you to hear me on this before we go any further. When I say real mom, I'm not talking about the stepmother who posted on Facebook 3 days after Nolan disappeared. I'm talking about Katie Hudson Seymour, Warren Hudson's biological mother, the woman most people covering this case don't even mention. She reached out early, before the pressure, before the lawyers, before the cameras, and what she allegedly said in those private messages does not match what the family told the public afterward.
And here, you read it. Sunday at 11:26. Good evening, Mr. Roll Down. I am Warren's mother, the woman you have been talking about on Facebook and posting pictures of our family. I am here to tell you that we all Nolan and are all deeply distraught. Maybe she meant we all love Nolan. Your information is not correct, and I ask you to please stop posting about Warren and our family. My son did not ride out with him, nor did he come back with him. Now, how do you know all of this? The boat that Nolan was supposed to get on, Wyatt boat. He repeatedly asked Nolan to get on boat at 5. She must not be very smart because she says get one boat at 5 when it was time to leave. But Nolan wanted to stay with a girl and their boat was parked next to his. So she's saying that Katie's boat was parked next to his. He was insistent about staying with this girl. Wyatt asked him several times to please get on the boat, and people heard him. My son loves him and would never in 1,000,000 years leave him. Warren does not even have a boat. Nolan has been our house several times, and he is the sweetest friend. We all adore him. Again, when Wyatt asked for him to get on, he said he wanted to stay, and Wyatt boat started to fill with water. His boat ended up breaking down and was towed in. I don't know this girl that he wanted to stay with. I can just tell you, though, my son had nothing to do with it in any way, shape, or form. A matter of fact, he was the first person that noticed he was missing when they got back to their friend's house and called his mother, the Coast Guard, and the sheriff's office. Warren is very responsible and always keeping up with everyone else. He was not on the boat again. Please stop hurting us. My son is beside himself. Now, I've never seen him like this before, and I ask you to please stop the blame. This is not the boy's fault. Nolan wanted to stay with this girl and was insistent. I ask you to take my picture down off of your wall and my son. I brought my other son out there, and I saw my son Warren briefly and took a picture that we were not out there with them longer than 10 minutes. I don't know how you're trying to link it all together, but I am just Warren's mom, and I love Nolan very much. He came to my house several times, and I'm so sad. Please keep this down and look for this on prayers for finding him. She's not very smart. I mean, low down, not row down. Also, I just want to let you know, this whole day we have been looking for him. It's been devastating. I don't even know any way any of this was being said. I had friends with taking this lady is really slow. I had friends with taking pictures of these messages. I am going to get off of social media. I was advised this is very destructive. I just ask you, please take it down, as I don't want us to get any more messages.
Ashley Cole said on Facebook that her son left the island around 4:30 p.m. when the boat was taking on water and they had an issue with the bilge pump. She said Nolan made a decision to stay on the island and return inland later with another group of friends. That's the official family statement from Warren's side. Simple, clean, almost too clean. Warren Hudson himself later said on a podcast that the group was in emergency. The boat, they were trying to save the boat. He said it's not like they didn't ask Nolan or they just left him, that Nolan decided to stay on the island with the girl he was with. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The girl was reportedly identified as 19-year-old Katie McCormack. She was on the island that day with a completely separate group. Her sister Gracie McCormack told the Daily Mail that Katie had a conversation and assumed Nolan was getting ready to get on the boat he came out on. That Katie assumed the friends telling him to get on the boat wouldn't have left him. Think about what that means. Warren and his group say Nolan chose to stay with the girl. The girl's family says she assumed Nolan was going back on the boat with the boys. She's saying he went to get on the boat. They're saying he didn't get on the boat, Ben Crump said. Somebody must not be telling the truth. That's not speculation. That's a documented contradiction between two groups of people who were both present that day, and that contradiction has never been resolved. Now layer Katie Hudson Seymour's messages on top of that. According to the content creator who shared these messages publicly, Warren's biological mother reached out early in this case, before any of these public statements were made, before Ashley Cole posted on Facebook, before Warren sat down with Brandon Tatum, before the lawyers got involved on either side, and what she allegedly communicated was not the polished version. It was rawer, more immediate, and critically, it included details about the timeline and about Warren's movements that day that do not sit cleanly with what we later heard. Now, I'm going to be careful here, because I don't have these messages independently verified. What I have is what was shared publicly, and what the community is doing with that information, which is comparing it line by line against the official accounts, and finding gaps. Here's one of the biggest friction points: the visit to the island itself. Multiple people following this case have raised the question of how long Warren's group was actually on Horn Island, because if you listen to Warren's own account, if you listen to the way the day is described, it doesn't sound like a full-day trip. It sounds brief, shorter than you'd expect for a 4th of July celebration that involved loading up a boat, traveling roughly 10 miles offshore to a barrier island, anchoring, setting up, and socializing. So what time did they arrive? What time did they actually leave? And how long was Nolan truly with this group on that island before they say they left him behind? Ashley Cole said Warren saw Nolan last at around 3 p.m. on July 4th. She then said they left around 4:30 p.m. when the boat was taking on water. So by the stepmother's own account, the last sighting and the departure are only 90 minutes apart, and we don't have a confirmed arrival time from their side. If they arrived late morning or early afternoon, that's potentially a very short window. If they arrived earlier, it raises a different question. Why was 3 p.m. the last time Warren saw his supposed best friend if they'd been together for hours? Notice this: no one disputes that Nolan was on that island. No one disputes that he did not come home. But the in-between, the hours between arrival and departure, between the last sighting and the moment someone finally reported him missing, that stretch of time is where every single account from the friend group gets hazy. And that's exactly where Katie Hudson Seymour's early messages become relevant. Because according to what was shared, her version touches on that window, and it doesn't match. Nolan was reported missing by his mother, Christine Wansley, shortly after midnight. That means from around 3 p.m. when Warren says he last saw Nolan to shortly after midnight when the alarm was actually raised, we're looking at roughly 9 hours. 9 hours. Warren Hudson was the friend who contacted Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, late on July 4th to report that Nolan was missing. But late on July 4th is vague. What does late mean? 8 p.m., 10 p.m., 11. And if Warren knew something was wrong early enough to call Nolan's mother, why was the formal missing person report not made until after midnight? Does that look like panic, or does that look like a plan? That's a question. Not an accusation, but it's a question that demands an answer. Now let me bring you back to Katie Hudson Seymour, because this is what makes her alleged messages so significant. If what was shared is accurate, she was communicating details about that day before the family had time to coordinate a public response. Before Ashley Cole made her first Facebook post on July 7th. That post didn't come until Tuesday, July 7th. 3 full days after Nolan disappeared. 2 days after his body was found, 3 days of silence from the stepmother, 3 days before any public statement from Warren's side of the family. But Katie Hudson Seymour, according to what's been shared, was already talking on July 5th, day 1 after the disappearance, day 0 of the search. Why does that matter? Because first statements are almost always the most revealing. before someone has time to think about how things look, before someone has time to talk to a lawyer, before someone has time to compare notes with other people who were there. The first thing a person says in a crisis, that's usually the closest thing to the truth you're going to get. And in this case, the first voice we hear from Warren's family is not the judge, it's not the stepmother with the carefully worded Facebook post, it's the biological mother reaching out privately to a content creator on day one. Think about the mechanics of that for a second. Why reach out to a content creator and not the police? Why reach out privately and not publicly? Was she trying to get ahead of something? Was she genuinely trying to help? Was she trying to shape a narrative before one formed? Or was she simply a mother who was scared and talking before she realized what her words might reveal? We don't know. And I'm not going to pretend we do. But the fact that those messages exist, and the fact that they allegedly contain details that conflict with later public statements, that is significant, that is worth examining, and that is exactly what the community around this case is doing right now. Nearly a month after Nolan Wells was found dead off Mississippi's Gulf Coast, investigators have completed the state's autopsy. Prosecutors are preparing to present evidence to a grand jury. Neither the official state autopsy nor the autopsy requested by his family has provided clear answers about the teen's death. The preliminary report of the independent autopsy said the cause of death was undetermined pending further investigation. Undetermined, not accidental drowning. Not homicide, undetermined. Authorities initially said they believe Wells likely died in an accidental drowning. But the independent autopsy commissioned by the family did not confirm that. It listed the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending investigation while noting several limitations. So right now, we have a dead 18-year-old. We have friends whose stories don't align with each other or with an independent witness. We have a biological mother whose early messages allegedly tell a different story than the one the family later put out publicly. We have a 9-hour gap between last sighting and missing person report. And we have 2 autopsies that haven't given the family or the public a clear answer. And here's the part that makes people's blood run cold. The threats came amid rampant speculation and scrutiny of the investigation, deepened in part by uncertainty surrounding Wells's final hours, distrust of law enforcement, and the state's long history of racist violence. The teenager, who was black, had traveled to the uninhabited island with a group of friends from high school, all of whom were white. This case doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in Mississippi. It exists in a state where the history of what happens to young black men in isolated places with groups of white people. That history is not ancient. It is living memory. And that context is not incidental. It is foundational to why this family and this community are demanding answers with the urgency they are. Now I want to stay on Katie Hudson Seymour's messages for a moment longer. Because what the community has done with this information is actually remarkable. They didn't just read the messages and react, they cross-referenced them, line by line, against Ashley Cole's Facebook posts, against Warren Hudson's podcast interview with Brandon Tatum, against the statements Katie McCormack's sister Gracie gave to the Daily Mail, against the known timeline. And what they found is a pattern. Not a pattern of one person lying, a pattern of multiple accounts that can't all be true at the same time. Notice this. Warren says Nolan chose to stay on the island. Katie McCormack's family says she assumed Nolan was getting on the boat with his friends. Ashley Cole says the boat was taking on water and they had to leave. Katie Hudson Seymour's early messages allegedly described the visit and departure differently than what Ashley later posted. 4 sources. 4 versions, 1 dead teenager. Now, a former federal prosecutor I consulted with made a point that I think reframes everything, and I want you to hear this carefully. She said, when you have a group of people who were all present at the same event and their accounts don't match each other, that's not unusual. People remember things differently, stress distorts memory, trauma compresses time, that's normal. But she said when the accounts don't match and they all conveniently point away from the same group of people, that's not memory, that's coordination. Or at minimum, it's self-preservation. And she was very clear. She said that doesn't prove a crime occurred. It doesn't prove anyone is guilty of anything. What it proves is that the investigation cannot stop at taking those statements at face value. Every single one of those accounts needs to be tested. independently against physical evidence, against phone records, against GPS data, against boat launch timestamps, against whatever surveillance exists at the marina, and the question she posed was this: has that happened yet? Have investigators actually pressure tested each of these accounts separately? Or have they been treated as a collective narrative from a group of friends who all happen to tell a version that clears them? That's not an accusation against law enforcement either. It's a standard investigative question, and it's one the family has been asking since day one. Think about what that means in practical terms. If you're an investigator and you have 4 or 5 people who were on that boat, you separate them. You interview them independently. You ask the same questions in different order. You look for the details that don't match. You check their phones. You check their locations. You pull their text messages from that day and the days after. You look at who called who and when. You look at whether there was a flurry of communication between them before anyone called Nolan's mother. Because here's the thing about that 9-hour window. Between 3 p.m. and midnight, if Warren Hudson knew something was wrong, if he knew his friend wasn't on the boat and wasn't coming home, the first call should have been to the Coast Guard, not to Nolan's mother 9 hours later. The Coast Guard has the resources for an island search. Nolan's mother, sitting at home in Pritchard, Alabama, does not. So why the delay? Why call the mother and not the authorities? And what was happening in those 9 hours? Those aren't rhetorical questions. Those are the questions that an investigation either answers or fails to answer. And right now, from everything publicly available, they remain unanswered. Let me bring in another voice here, because this isn't just about messages and timelines. This is about what the physical evidence does and does not tell us. A forensic pathologist who reviewed the publicly available details of both autopsy reports made an important distinction. She said there's a difference between someone who drowns because they got caught in a current while swimming and someone who enters the water under other circumstances. She said in a straightforward accidental drowning, you typically see certain markers: water in the lungs consistent with active respiration while submerged, no significant external trauma, a toxicology profile that either shows impairment or doesn't. But she said when a cause of death comes back undetermined, that word carries weight. It means the pathologist could not conclusively say this was a drowning. It means something in the findings gave them pause. It means there are questions the body alone cannot answer, and she stressed that undetermined is not the same as unknown. Unknown means we have no idea. Undetermined means we have information, but it doesn't point cleanly in one direction. There are competing possibilities. And without more context, without knowing exactly how this person ended up in the water, the science alone can't close the case. That's not me speculating. That's a forensic expert explaining what undetermined actually means in practice. And it means this case is not closed. It means the manner of death is still an open question, and every open question in a case like this is a question the friends on that boat need to answer. Now let me address something that's been running underneath this entire case, because you can't talk about Nolan Wells without talking about it. And pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Nolan Wells was black. Every friend on that boat was white. The island is off the coast of Mississippi, and the initial response from local law enforcement treated this as a likely accidental drowning before the autopsies were even complete. Ben Crump stood with this family and said publicly that if the roles were reversed, if a white teenager disappeared with a group of black friends on an island and turned up dead 2 days later, every single one of those friends would have been detained and questioned that night, not 9 hours later, not the next day, that night. Reverend Al Sharpton addressed this case and drew a direct line between the lack of urgency in the initial response and the racial dynamics at play. The NOC passed a resolution calling for a full independent investigation. The FBI has been asked to review the case. This is not background noise. This is the engine driving the demand for accountability. Because the family is not asking for a predetermined outcome. They're not asking for someone to be convicted before a trial. They're asking for something much simpler and much harder to argue against. They're asking for the investigation to treat their son's death with the same seriousness it would receive if he were white. And when you look at the timeline of how this case was handled in its first 72 hours, that question answers itself. Christine Wansley, Nolan's mother, has said publicly that she wants the truth. She said she wants to know what happened to her baby. She's not performing for cameras. She's not making political speeches. She is a mother who sent her son to a 4th of July gathering with friends, and he never came home. And the friends who were supposed to be with him, the friends who were supposed to bring him home, they left. And then they waited, and then they called, and then they lawyered up, and then the stories started shifting. Notice this. Warren Hudson hired an attorney. The other friends on the boat have gone largely silent. Ashley Cole deleted or modified her original Facebook posts according to people who screenshotted them early. And Katie Hudson Seymour, the biological mother who allegedly reached out first, has gone quiet too. Everyone who was talking early stopped talking, and everyone who wasn't talking early started talking through lawyers. That's not evidence of guilt. I want to be clear about that. People have every right to retain counsel. People have every right to remain silent. Those are constitutional protections, and they exist for good reason. But from the family's perspective, from Christine Wansley's perspective, the silence feels like a wall. And every day that wall stays up is another day she doesn't have answers about her son. Here's where things stand legally right now. The state autopsy has been completed. The independent autopsy commissioned by the family listed cause and manner of death as undetermined. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has said the investigation is ongoing. The FBI has been asked to review the case for potential civil rights implications. Prosecutors are reportedly preparing to present evidence to a grand jury. No charges have been filed. No one has been arrested. No one has been formally named as a suspect. But the grand jury process is significant because it means prosecutors believe there is enough to put before a panel. It means this has moved beyond a preliminary investigation. It means someone in the system looked at the evidence and said this needs to go further. Whether the grand jury returns an indictment, that's an open question. Grand juries hear only the prosecution's side. There's no defense attorney in the room. The standard is probable cause, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But even getting to that room, in a case that was initially treated as an accidental drowning, that's movement. That's pressure working. That's a family and a community refusing to let this be swept into the water along with their son. What would you have done if your 18-year-old went to an island with friends and those friends came back without him and didn't call you for 9 hours, and then the stories didn't match, and then the lawyers showed up, and then the silence started? What would you have done? I think you'd do exactly what Christine Wansley is doing. You'd stand in front of every camera. You'd call every lawyer. You'd demand every investigation. And you'd refuse to sit down until someone told you the truth. The community following this case has done something important. They've taken the publicly available statements from every party involved and laid them side by side. They've tracked the contradictions, they've documented the deletions, they've preserved the screenshots, and they've kept the pressure on when the news cycle tried to move on. That's not a mob, that's accountability. There's a difference, and Katie Hudson Seymour's messages, whether they were sent out of fear or honesty or panic or guilt, they exist as a timestamp, a marker of what was being said privately before the public story was built. And the distance between those two versions, the private and the public, that distance is not small, and it has not been explained. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He went to spend the 4th of July with people he trusted, and he never came home. His mother, Christine Wansley, said something that I think should be the last thing you hear today. She said she just wants to know what happened to her baby. That's all. She said Nolan deserved better than to be left on an island. He deserved better than silence. He deserved better than stories that keep changing. And she's right. He did. So here's the question we started with. And it's the same question we're ending with. If the earliest account from Warren Hudson's own biological mother doesn't match the story his stepmother and his friends later told the world, which version is closer to the truth and why did it change? We don't have that answer yet, but we're going to keep following this until we do. Now I want to hear from you. After everything you've just heard, after the messages, the contradictions, the 9-hour gap, the undetermined autopsy, what stands out to you most? Drop it in the comments. Because this case isn't going away, and neither are we.